Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. Unlike what we saw with Murphy last week, in Endgame, the physical manifestation of disability is perpetually before us on stage, and its specificity is only assuaged by the elusive play of language that we are made alert to as if pursuing the threads of an inexhaustible game. But also central to the play is the question of the body in pain, which, as we shall see, is crucial for linking Beckett directly to concerns in disability studies. Without attempting to make too strong a link between the details of his own life and that of the characters in his writing, it is nonetheless interesting to note that Beckett regularly encountered various disabled figures at close quarters, as well as suffering various forms of disability in his lifetime. As background research to the writing of the mercy seat scenes in Murphy, he closely questioned his friend Jeffrey Thompson, who in February 1935 had started working as a senior house physician at the Royal Hospital in Beckenham in Kent, a place for the treatment of mental illness. And from August to December 1945, he worked as a quartermaster/interpreter for the Normandy Hospital at Saint-Lô. Furthermore, Beckett's aunt, Cissy Sinclair, is acknowledged to have been the model for the character of Ham in Endgame. As James Knowlson tells us in Damned to Fame, Beckett used to wheel her around in her wheelchair when she was crippled with arthritis, and she frequently used to ask him to straighten up the statue. She also had a telescope with which she used to spy out the ships in Dublin Bay. Furthermore, Endgame was completed shortly after the death of his brother Frank, after a period of cancer that left Beckett devastated. Knowlson describes Endgame's flint-like comedy as being sparked out of darkness and pain. Perhaps what is even more pertinent to the question of Beckett and disability is that he himself suffered endless illnesses, ranging from an arrhythmic heartbeat and night sweats to numerous cysts and abscesses in his fingers, the palm of his left hand, the top of his palate, his scrotum, and most painfully later in life on his left lung. These led to regular bodily discomfort for him. It seems then that the deteriorating body had a special attraction for Beckett because his own body reminded him of its pain and mortality in a forceful way. He was thus able to use the disabled, maimed, and decaying body as a multiple reference for a variety of ideas that seem to have been at least partially triggered by encounters with others and by his own personal experience of pain and temporary disability. As we noted a moment ago, unlike in the case of Murphy from last week, in Endgame, the physical manifestations of disability are always before us on stage, and their specificity is only diverted by the elusive play of language, as though we were in the pursuit of an inexhaustible game. Endgame also happens to have many references to corpses and decay, while also representing characters in various attempts at forestalling this imminent decay. Ham's parents, Nag and Nell, have no legs and live in dustbins on stage. We also find Ham regularly asking Clove for his painkillers. But to capture the peculiar struggle between decay and the efforts against it, both at the level of the characters' own interactions and as part of the governing ethos of the play, it might perhaps be useful to imagine the stage set as smelling permanently of antiseptic, as in a hospital. This would be to take seriously Ham's remark that we stink already. The whole place stinks of corpses. Even though there is no evidence in any of Beckett's own productions of the play of an invocation of hospital conditions, the strong smell of antiseptic I'm suggesting here would help to counter the critical anesthetizations that often assimilate the impaired and alien body in Endgame to an abstract philosophical category. By suggesting a different dimension to the action, the smell of antiseptic would forcefully place audiences and readers in a location they most likely would not like either to be at or be reminded of, thus putting them in a conceptual domain that directly subtends the condition of immobility and discomfort displayed on stage. As many commentators have noted, Ham's disability complements Clove's in a variety of ways. He is wheelchair bound, while Clove cannot sit. Ham is completely blind, while Clove is partially so. But this inextricable interdependency is also consolidated at other levels. Clove needs Ham for sustenance, while also acting in practical terms as Ham's prosthesis. Ham's insistence on knowing what lies outside their desolate room is satisfied by Clove's spying out the landscape with the telescope, another prosthesis of vision. That, significantly, also renders Clove himself dependent to a degree upon a notion of extension. Another counterpoint is that setup between movement and stillness. Whereas Ham is perforce stationary, unless he can get Clove to move him around in his wheelchair, Clove is constantly moving about doing things, such as opening the curtain and adjusting the painting that hangs up close to the window, moving the ladder backwards and forwards, and also reporting movement from the kitchen. The movement in the kitchen is itself metonymically displaced onto the mouse that Clove tries to kill, as if to suggest that that movement itself has to be brought to stillness. Then there is his repeated threat to leave Ham, to move away to someplace else, as it were. Nothing seems to happen on stage, and yet this nothingness is marked by almost frantic movement by one of the characters, namely Clove. In this way, Beckett sets up a constitutive contrast between immobility and movement. Ham's immobility serves to accentuate Clove's labored movements and to intensify his every gesture, while Clove's movements serve to further highlight the immobility and sometimes even statuesque posture of the other characters. When Clove himself stops moving, it is almost as if he is winding down to the position of immobility of the other characters. The dialectical relationship between immobility and mobility in a play constituted exclusively by characters that carry various impairments, serve to further accentuate the existential constraints of disability. Every move within this dialectic is dependent on its opposite, thus suggesting that all the key terms of impairment, disability, immobility, and non-disability mobility are part of a single continuum. And yet, the contrast between Clove's movement on and off stage and the immobility that is enjoined for Ham, Nag, and Nell is not so much a demarcation of the opposition between mobility and immobility as in the demarcation between different temporalities. For at one level, the counterbalance of movement non-movement is that between different rates of action and decay. The differentiated temporalities of movement and immobility are predominantly suggested in the contrast between the current condition of the characters and the stories they tell about their pasts to assuage their impotence in the present. These stories often serve to demarcate a different world of action in the past to the one that we see depicted on stage. More importantly, the stories of their past, of Ham, Nag, and Nell, were not those of disability, but appear to have had active and interactive lives. Contrastively, nothing seems to happen in the present tense of the dramatic action. All that is left for the characters is the recollection of past events. Central to Ham's characterization in particular is his capacity to adopt various narratological positions to invoke the past in order to counteract his sense of present inadequacy. Discussing this feature of Endgame, Jonathan Bolter notes that acts of narrative in the play function as the momentary liberation from constraint, especially for Ham. As he points out, narrative operates hermeneutically in the sense that it offers the possibility of inscribing an alternative temporality, an alternative way or time of being. Bolter focuses on what he calls an act of historiography on the part of the characters that allows them to interpret and rewrite the past. We have to add, however, that the rewriting of the past is not just an act of interpretative predisposition. Rather, involved in the interpretation of the past are struggles about agency. This agency does not mirror the present, but displaces it onto an earlier phase of temporality, which earlier phase is more active. In the case of Ham together with Clove, their relationship contrasts sharply with that of Nag and Nell. For whereas Clove is highly mobile and Ham is not, it is Ham who controls the narrativization of the past and constantly attempts to return to it in accounting for both past and present. Unlike in the case of Nag and Nell, Clove does not seem to have any clearly shared past from which to challenge Ham. In Nell and Nag's case, mobility and immobility are themselves obverse displacement of the impulse to narrate. That is to say, they counter the immobility of the present and the fixedness of the position of the lead listener or addressee. The sterility of Ham's past derives from a different source than that of Nag and Nell's past. In his case, the sterility comes from the fact that he is alone in having access to that past, but does not interrogate himself in retelling it. Apart from one instance where Clove refers to some passing kindness that Ham had shown him in the past, Ham is almost utterly alone in the past of which he speaks, and is the only one who seems to have access to it. It is perhaps this aloneness in the past that makes him so insistent on constituting the other characters as his captive listeners, almost as if to relieve the loneliness of that past by the dialogical context of the present. Of the many implied dialectical relationships between Ham and Clove that we may take account of, such as master-slave, disabled person, caregiver, and so on, the most significant with respect to the different claims to agency inherent in the dialectic is that suggested by the implicit Prospero and Caliban aerial pairing. Clove himself retorts to Ham, very Caliban-like, about the efficacy of the language he has been taught by him to speak. Ham, yesterday. What does that mean, yesterday? Clove, violently. That means the bloody awful day, long ago, before this bloody awful day. I use the words you taught me. If they don't mean anything anymore, teach me others, or let me be silent. Ham as Prospero is directly referenced when he states cryptically, after Nag's lament on fatherhood, our revels now are ended, and he gropes blindly for the dog, and thus initiates a new trajectory for the dialogue with a plaintive complaint. The dog's gone. The echo from the Tempest is to Act 4, Scene 1, line 148. But the significance of this echo lies not so much in what it allows us to be reminded about the master-slave relationship between Ham Prospero and Clove Caliban Ariel, as in the desire to control the narrativization of the past. In the many bad-tempered exchanges between Prospero and Caliban on the one hand, and Prospero and Ariel on the other, what is repeated without fail is Prospero's absolute claim to an interpretation of the past. Like Prospero, Ham's impulse to narrate is similarly a will to power. In Ham's case, even though the will to power remains intact throughout the play, the nature of his dependence on Clove makes it such that he's always undermined in his desire for power and authority. The dependence is no idle one. It gains the force of necessity, fate almost, in that Ham is ontologically validated at various levels only by the presence of Clove. This validation is even true of Ham's role as narrator. Clove, what is there to keep me here? Ham, the dialogue. The speaker-interlocutor binary is different from all the other ones within the series I noted earlier that define the complex of relations between Ham and Clove, because it is also foundationally the engine of dramatic action as such. When in 6th century Greece, Thespis decided to alter the structure of the dithyramb by introducing a speaker to interact with the singers, the structure of dramatic interlocution was born for Greek drama and for all subsequent dramatic forms. What Beckett does with what is definitive of drama is to elevate this aspect of dramatic structure into the status of an ontological necessity. The force of that elevation lies in the fact that its collapse is always being threatened by Clove's constantly reiterated but frequently deferred decision to leave. His departure would coincide not just with the threatened death of Ham, but concomitantly with the death of the essence of dramatic action as such. For Ham, the situation is desperate because Clove is his primary and only caregiver. Being disabled, he literally requires Clove to keep him alive. His persistent reversions to a narratorial mode, then, can be read as his attempt to maintain Clove's abiding interest, both so as to allow him to re-narrativize his positions in the past, and also to keep Clove fixed in the position of caregiver/interlocutor, both of which are mutually defining and central to the relationship between the two characters. Elaine Scarry suggests in her book The Body in Pain from 1985 that one of the complex things about pain is that it produces epistemological certainty for the pain sufferer, but the possibility of doubt for the non-sufferer. The bearer of the pain cannot not be in certainty about his or her own pain, whereas the one not in pain may entertain some doubt about the veracity or intensity of what the bearer of the pain claims to be feeling. And yet in Endgame, even though Ham is obviously in pain, two factors serve to blur the reality of this within the play. The first is that Clove does not seem to recognize or acknowledge it, rather behaving in an uncharacteristically sadistic manner in the way in which he announces at some point that the painkillers are finished, and in the speed with which he shifts from the issue of painkillers to moving about the room to find a place to put down the alarm clock. In that way, Clove suggests that whatever pain the painkillers were meant to alleviate is not as significant as the immediacy of his concern to be relieved of the burden of carrying the alarm clock around the room. Clove does not pause to bear witness to Ham's pain. In this, Clove is only replicating the lack of empathy that had been shown to him by Ham when it was his turn to complain about the bitter pain in his legs. What is even more curious, however, is the speed with which Ham himself moves away from worrying about pain when he's told that the painkillers are finished. He shifts from a primal scream of pain and frustration to asking Clove to look out the window with his telescope in the space of barely 3 lines, never again to refer either to the painkillers or indeed to his pain for the rest of the play. What seems to be happening here in Endgame is like every thematic referent that has appeared in the course of the action, pain itself has become a nondescript part of an array of conceptual enigmas. There is no privilege given to it whatsoever. But if pain is allowed to become equivalent to the many things that have fleetingly emerged across the relationship between the two men, and indeed between Nag and Nell, then might it not be said also that their impairments are themselves only part of the textual apparatus of the constant negation and deferral of categories and nothing more? To put it more bluntly, if discomfort and pain are not recognized as pertinent either to their disabled and constrained conditions or to the structure of interlocution between them, then to what degree might it be said that their impairments are themselves not merely a cipher of the condition of frailty as opposed to the referent of real suffering as such? To settle on such a conclusion, we have to completely ignore the evidence of the multiple impairments that are placed before us on stage. It also means to close our eyes to the evidence of distressed embodiment that is woven into many of Beckett's plays and novels, and that help to define his relevance for a disability studies perspective. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.